Please be seated. Good morning, St. Margaret's. Very blessed fourth Sunday in Lent to you. I thought I'd start off this morning by sharing with you just the very real joy I've experienced these past several weeks as together we've begun walking down our Lenten path. I love the Gospel of John. And one thing I love about John and the stories that we've heard from John is how these stories are so different, yet they're connected by a single thread. I'm going to give us something of a recap. 2 weeks ago, I talked about prayer and discernment. And I used the story of Nicodemus and Jesus, this image of darkness giving way to light. A week ago, I talked about gratitude, and I used the story of the woman at the well. It's an image of healing turning into self-giving love. And just a few moments ago, we heard the story of Jesus and the man born blind. It's an image of ignorance coming face to face with truth. These are such different stories, such distinct images. Yet they each point us to the transformation that's possible anytime someone has an encounter with Jesus. In John's gospel, Jesus changes everything. He makes all things new. One thing I love about John's gospel is how relevant these stories are to the world that we live in, the 21st century. Especially that story we heard a few moments ago. I know this seems distant from us. 2,000 years have passed, a man born blind, and these religious leaders, and these very strange conversations. And yet at heart, this is a story of a collision between ignorance and knowledge. And it's very relevant to our lives today. It may be the most relevant story that we come across in all the New Testament. And think about it for a moment. One of the fundamental challenges of living in modern America is figuring out how to live with and in the tension that exists between our culture's signal and our culture's noise. I don't know if you're familiar with that distinction, but it means something like this. Signal. Our world now has faster and more comprehensive access to knowledge than has ever been experienced before in human history. There is so much data out there for us to glean if we're interested. So much signal for us to discern, to listen to comprehend. We are awash in information. And yet, despite this data, despite the signal, we're also drowning in noise. We live in a noisy culture, don't we? I mean, every day we're subject to countless forces, and they're shaping us in ways that we can't even begin to comprehend. I mean, we're bombarded by advertising, infotainment, the countless images of that never-ending scroll that is social media. And these forces are pulling us in a million different directions. We hear so many messages each and every day, and each one of these messages disagrees with the other. Is it any wonder then that our culture seems to be losing its way? We don't know what to believe or why to believe it. And all of this, I think, makes for a rather ironic picture. Friends, we live in an age of information, but then we're struggling to answer some of the most basic questions in life. It's into all this morning, a few moments ago, that we heard the story of the man born blind. What I love about the story is that underneath the complexity, and all the back and forth conversations, there's a rather simple message for us to learn. Embracing truth, getting to the signal despite all the noise, that's less a matter for our heads than it is our hearts. You see, the religious leaders throughout the story this morning, they have access to everything they could ever need in order to discern the truth. In fact, they're pretty lucky because everything they receive is signal. They encounter no noise. Despite all this, though, these leaders struggle. They struggle because they can't see the narratives they've constructed for themselves. And they don't understand whether those narratives they're living out might be in conflict with God's grand story of redemption. Instead of acknowledging God as the author of our stories, God as the arbiter of all truth, they think of themselves as the arbiters of truth, themselves as the authors of their stories. Instead of approaching God in order to receive sight, they reject the Son of Man in an act of willful ignorance. I'll tell you, none of this has much to do with those things our culture tends to associate with knowledge, right? I mean, our culture thinks of knowledge as something that comes about through evidence and deduction, proof and reason. But that's not what's happening this morning. And that's not what happens with us either, to be clear. Before we want to stand in judgment on these religious leaders, friends, we are no different. The vast majority of what you and I believe on any given day has little to do with evidence, deduction, proof, and reason. Contrary to what our culture tells us, we are not computers that examine evidence. No, we are humans that tell stories. Almost everything we humans believe in this world is determined by the narratives we construct. We are creatures of testimony. We live our lives in stories. In the words of philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. It's stories that make the world go round. It's stories that tend to make us laugh or cry, to give or to receive. It's stories that capture our hearts, convincing us what is actually true and good and beautiful in this, our riven and broken world. And so, what I love about this story from John's gospel is that embedded there in the heart of a rather lengthy narrative, embedded in the back and the forth, embedded in the debates and the theological speculation, the man shares with the people around him and with us a rather simple story. It's just 13 words in length. The man says, "One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." What a beautiful story this is. By the grace of God, that man's story is a single thread in that larger tapestry that is God's redeeming and restoring love. The heart of the story, the heart of the season that we're in, Lent, of course, is found in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That story then marches on in the book of Acts as we read in the New Testament, where the disciples, who once were scared and lonely, find themselves empowered by the Spirit of God, empowered to fan a flame that would eventually light the world on fire. That same story marches on through history with the countless stories, some known and many unknown, of men and women who came in their own day to become convinced that Jesus really was the risen Son of God. And that story, that great tapestry, it continues on today, even this morning. Of course, we here at St. Margaret's, we have our own narrative thread, do we not? As I like to say, it's one filled with both setbacks as well as triumphs. And we've been talking about this story quite a lot during this Lenten season, and especially as we pursue this Next Dream capital campaign. And yet, what I want to share with you this morning is this. As important as our collective story is, and it's quite important, knowing where we have come from and knowing where we are going is critical. And yet, as important as that story is, I don't ever want us to lose sight of how important all our stories are. Each and every person who calls St. Margaret's their home has their own story. They can tell the story of who they are, where they've come from, and why they're here. We all have our own stories about those things that have drawn us into this place. Those moments where we've sensed the Spirit of God at work in our midst. We can tell stories about those relationships that have shown us in flesh and blood the inexhaustible love of Jesus Christ, that have demonstrated to us just what it means when we call ourselves the body of Christ. We all have our stories of this place, and we need to know these stories. We need to tell these stories, share these stories. And we need to each understand that when we support this place, when we build up this body, we're supporting those precious and beautiful stories. We're building up and supporting these precious and beautiful souls. So that's my homily in praise of stories. At this point, you might have realized or wondered in your heart how talking about stories, right? It's not as interesting as actually telling them, right? And so I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. This week is going to be a little bit different. It's going to stretch us in some ways. It's going to stretch me in some ways. And so I'm going to start off now just by telling a little bit about my own story. And my story goes something like this. God called me to this place before a global pandemic hit our world. And yet, obviously, much of my tenure here has been marked by that global pandemic. And it's been a lot of ups and downs, and it's been a lot of challenges. The reason why I talk about challenges and triumphs about St. Margaret's is because I'm also speaking from my own heart. I've encountered my own challenges, my own setbacks, as well as my own victories and my own triumphs. And despite all these ups and downs, despite the heartache, despite the joy, the one thing that has been left in me and with me is this. And my coming to this place has really strengthened my faith in Jesus. It really has. It's strengthened my faith because I'm convinced to my bones that it was God who called me to this place, in this time, in this season. It's God that called me to this place to lead us to the crossroads that we are now at. God has been so good to us in and through this global pandemic. God has been so good to us to lead us to these crossroads where we can at last write our next chapter, where we can at last dream our next dream. And so I'm excited by this campaign. I'm excited at the future that awaits us. I'm excited to share that I believe in this campaign, and just as my family and I, we will be giving to this campaign sacrificially. I think most of you know that we're a family of 5. We're a young family of 5. We live off of one full-time income. We don't have a ton of margin when it comes to our finances. And yet, I am ready to give sacrificially because I believe in St. Margaret's. I'm ready to give because I believe in you. That's a bit of my story. I'm just one person. What's even more interesting to me, what's more captivating to me, is the stories that you might share. And so, we're going to close now with something that's really quite different. We're going to close now with something we're calling snapshot testimonies. I'll say this about testimony. I love testimony. I love testimony because I love stories. I think the Christian faith isn't taught so much as it is caught. We are a people of stories, and therefore we need to be a people of testimony. And in a sense, it makes me sad that it's taken me this long to come and to do something so beautiful as this. What you're about to see, St. Margaret's, are 2-sentence stories that have been lovingly and faithfully written and will be shared by your fellow parishioners. And these stories are going to be about how God has used us, St. Margaret's, our parish community, to do something profound in their lives. And so before I hand over the floor, this is my parting encouragement to you. Pay close attention to these stories. Pay close attention and discern the voice of God as it emerges out of these stories. Listen to that voice. Consider God's invitation. And discern how God might be calling you to strengthen, support, to bless these stories. And not just these stories, but all our stories. God is inviting us into something new. God is calling us to write a next chapter. God is calling us to dream our next dream. And so let's listen to these stories. Let's thank God for these stories. And let's join together, arm in arm, as we see where our stories lead us next.